The hands tell you everything. That's what Sergeant Michael Barrett learned in his first week at Clarence House. Watch the hands, his trainer had said, because royals never show emotion in their faces. But their hands betray them every time. A clenched fist hidden in a coat pocket, fingers drumming against a teacup saucer, a thumb pressed hard against an index finger until the knuckle turns white. The hands always know the truth before the face admits it. Barrett had been watching hands for 6 years. He'd seen Princess Anne's fingers tighten around a briefcase handle when a photographer got too close. He'd noticed King Charles absently adjusting his cufflinks 17 times during a tense meeting with parliamentary advisers. He'd observed Prince William's hand move instinctively toward his children whenever a crowd surged forward. But he'd never seen what he saw that afternoon in the East Gallery corridor. He'd never seen a royal hand rise up in anger toward a child, not until Camilla lifted hers toward 9-year-old Princess Charlotte. The thing about palace duty is that nothing prepares you for the moment everything changes. You train for terrorist attacks and medical emergencies and security breaches. You run drills for fire evacuations and suspicious packages and unauthorized entry. But nobody trains you for the moment when you have to choose between protocol and protection, between following orders and doing what's right. Barrett made his choice in less than 2 seconds. He stepped between them, and in doing so, he set off a chain of events that would expose secrets the palace had kept hidden for 3 years. But before we continue, make sure you hit subscribe on Royal Guard Files. We're bringing you these untold stories from inside the palace walls every single day. Drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Now, back to what happened in that corridor. It was the second week of November, the kind of grey afternoon where London fog creeps through every windowsill and makes the palace feel smaller than it actually is. Barrett was assigned to interior corridor duty on the second floor, East Wing, a quiet post. The kind of assignment guards called a gift rotation, because nothing ever happened there. The family used those corridors to move between private quarters and formal rooms without being seen by staff or visitors. It was supposed to be peaceful, private, safe. Barrett had taken his position at 1400 hours, right where the East Gallery corridor branched off toward the family's residential section. Standard 4-hour rotation. He'd been standing there for 90 minutes when he heard the voices. 2 of them, one high and nervous, one low and sharp, both coming from around the corner where the corridor turned toward the Queen Consort's private sitting room. The first voice belonged to Charlotte. He recognized it immediately. She had a distinctive way of speaking, proper and careful, the result of years of protocol training. But there was something else in her voice that afternoon. Something that made Barrett's shoulders tense, even though he couldn't yet see what was happening. Fear. The kind of fear a child tries very hard to hide. "I didn't mean to," Charlotte was saying. Her words came quickly, tumbling over each other. "I was just looking for Mama. I didn't know you were in there. I knocked. I did knock." The second voice cut through like a blade through silk. Cold, precise. Controlled in a way that somehow made it worse than shouting would have been. "You knocked after you'd already opened the door. Do you understand the difference, Charlotte? Or do we need to have another conversation about boundaries?" Barrett's training said, "Stay at your post." His instincts said, "Move." He'd heard that tone before from Camilla, usually directed at staff members who'd committed some minor infraction. A tea setting placed on the wrong side of a table. A schedule adjustment made without prior consultation. But he'd never heard her use it with any of the children. Not with George, not with Louis, and definitely not with Charlotte, who everyone in the security detail knew tried harder than the boys to follow every rule, to be perfect, to never cause problems. "I'm sorry," Charlotte said again. Her voice was smaller now, quieter. "I'll remember next time. I promise I'll remember." "Will you?" Camilla's words came slowly, deliberately. "Because this is the 3rd time this month you've interrupted my private time. The 3rd time I've had to explain to you that certain rooms are not for children, that some spaces in this household are reserved for adults who have actual responsibilities. Barrett had moved without deciding to move. His feet carried him around the corner before his mind could list all the reasons why this was a terrible idea. Protocol said you didn't interrupt royal conversations. You didn't insert yourself into family matters. You observed and protected from a distance unless there was clear physical danger. But something in Charlotte's voice had triggered every protective instinct Barrett possessed. The same instinct that had made him join the military at 18. The same instinct that had driven him to apply for palace duty. The same instinct that told him when something was very, very wrong. What he saw when he rounded that corner made his blood run cold. Charlotte stood with her back pressed against the corridor wall, small for her age, still in her school uniform. Her hands were clasped in front of her, fingers twisted together so tightly her knuckles had gone white. Her eyes were fixed on the floor. She wasn't crying. That was the worst part. She wasn't crying because she'd already learned that crying made things worse. Camilla stood 3 feet away from her, tall, composed, dressed in a deep burgundy suit that made her look like she'd just stepped out of a formal portrait. But her right hand was raised. Not all the way, not in a fully striking position, but raised nonetheless. Shoulder height, palm flat, fingers together. The universal gesture that comes right before contact. The gesture that says, I could, even if I don't. The gesture that leaves no bruises but plants fear deep in a child's bones. Barrett had a split second to make a decision that would define his career and possibly end it. He could back away, pretend he hadn't seen, file a vague report that would get buried in palace bureaucracy. Or he could do what every fibre of his being told him to do. He could protect the child in front of him from the adult threatening her, even if that adult wore a crown, even if that adult could destroy his life with a single phone call. He stepped forward, directly into the space between them. His movement was smooth, professional, the kind of positioning guards practice until it becomes muscle memory. He didn't rush. He didn't grab. He simply placed his body where Camilla's hand had been heading, a human shield between the queen consort and the 9-year-old princess, pressing herself against the wall. Your Majesty, Barrett said. His voice was calm, respectful, absolutely firm. I apologize for the interruption, but I've been asked to escort Princess Charlotte to the Cambridge apartments. The Princess of Wales has requested her presence immediately. It was a lie, a complete fabrication. Kate hadn't requested anything. But Barrett had learned that the best lies contain enough truth to sound plausible. And right now, getting Charlotte away from this corridor was the only thing that mattered. Camilla's hand lowered slowly. Her face remained composed, but her eyes narrowed. Barrett had seen that look before, on officers who'd been questioned by subordinates, on officials who'd been challenged in public. It was the look of someone calculating consequences, weighing costs, deciding how much damage they could inflict without causing themselves problems. The Princess of Wales made no such request through proper channels, Camilla said. Each word was precisely enunciated. I would have been informed of any schedule changes involving the children. Barrett held his ground. He was acutely aware of Charlotte behind him, still pressed against the wall, still silent. He could feel her eyes on his back, watching, waiting, trying to understand if this stranger was making things better or infinitely worse. The request came through personal security channels, Your Majesty, Barrett continued. A private matter. I'm certain someone will update the household schedule accordingly. But for now, I need to fulfill my duty and escort the princess to her mother. The silence that followed lasted perhaps 5 seconds, maybe less, but it stretched in Barrett's mind like an hour. He watched Camilla's face, watched her fingers curl and uncurl at her side, watched her decide whether pushing this confrontation further was worth the risk of having a witness in uniform, A witness who could file reports. A witness who might talk. Very well, Camilla said finally. Her voice had shifted. Not warmer, but more controlled. The anger buried under layers of propriety. Please inform the Princess of Wales that in the future, schedule changes should be communicated through appropriate household channels. We do try to maintain some semblance of order in this residence. She turned without waiting for a response. Her heels clicked against the hardwood floor as she walked back toward her sitting room. The sound echoed in the corridor long after she'd disappeared around the corner. The door closed with a soft but definitive click. And then there was just silence. Barrett and Charlotte, a guard and a princess, standing in a corridor that suddenly felt much colder than it had minutes before. Barrett waited until he heard the lock engage on Camilla's door. Then he turned slowly, carefully, keeping his movements non-threatening. Charlotte was still against the wall, but her hands had loosened slightly. Her eyes were wide. Not with fear now, but with something else. Confusion, maybe. Or recognition that something important had just happened. Something that wasn't supposed to happen. Something that broke the rules everyone in the palace lived by. Your Royal Highness, Barrett said quietly, would you like me to take you to your mother? Charlotte nodded. She didn't speak. Her voice seemed to have disappeared somewhere during the confrontation. She pushed herself away from the wall and fell into step beside Barrett as he began walking toward the Cambridge apartments. Her footsteps were almost silent against the floor, a child who'd learned how to take up as little space as possible. They walked for 30 seconds before Charlotte spoke. Her voice was so soft, Barrett almost didn't hear it. She wasn't going to hit me. Barrett kept walking, kept his eyes forward, kept his voice neutral. I know, Your Highness. She never actually hits me, Charlotte continued. She gets close, and her voice gets like that. And I know I've done something wrong again. I know I've disappointed her again. Barrett's jaw tightened. He'd heard variations of this before. From children in domestic situations. From kids whose parents wielded psychological control like a weapon. The bruises you can't see are often the ones that last longest. But he couldn't say that to Charlotte. He couldn't explain to a 9-year-old that what she'd just described was abuse. That the fear in her voice was exactly what Camilla wanted her to feel. That making a child believe they're constantly disappointing is a form of violence all its own. Your mother will be glad to see you, Barrett said instead. It was the only safe response he could offer. The only words that wouldn't cross professional lines he was already dangerously close to violating. They reached the Cambridge apartments in less than 2 minutes. Barrett knocked on the private entrance, the one the family used when they wanted to avoid formal receiving areas. Kate answered the door herself. She was in casual clothes, jeans and a sweater, hair pulled back. The kind of outfit she wore when she thought nobody was watching, when she could just be a mother instead of a princess. Her smile faded the moment she saw Charlotte's face. A mother's instinct is faster than any security training. Kate dropped to one knee, bringing herself to Charlotte's eye level, her hands reaching out to cup her daughter's face. What happened? Kate's voice was gentle but urgent. Her eyes moved from Charlotte to Barrett and back again. Charlotte, sweetheart, what's wrong? Charlotte's composure finally broke. Not into tears, but into something almost worse. A kind of flat exhaustion that no 9-year-old should know how to feel. I went into Camilla's sitting room by accident. I was looking for you. I thought you might be in there. I knocked, but I guess I opened the door while I was knocking, and she was upset, and she said, I never learn boundaries, and I keep interrupting her private time, and I promised I'd be better, but I don't think she believed me. And... Hey, slow down, Kate interrupted. She pulled Charlotte into a hug, wrapping both arms around her daughter, creating a physical barrier between Charlotte and the rest of the world. Over Charlotte's shoulder, Kate's eyes found Barrett's. The question was silent but clear. What really happened? Barrett's training said, report only facts, no interpretations, no personal opinions, just observable data. But the look in Kate's eyes told him she already knew something was wrong, that this wasn't the first time Charlotte had come back shaken from an encounter with Camilla, that there was a pattern here neither of them could quite name, but both could feel. I found Princess Charlotte in the East Gallery corridor, ma'am, Barrett said carefully. She appeared distressed. I thought it best to bring her directly to you. Kate's eyes didn't leave his face. She was reading between the words, searching for what he couldn't say. Was she alone? No, ma'am. The Queen Consort was present. Something shifted in Kate's expression. Not surprise exactly. More like confirmation. Like a suspicion that had just been validated. She held Charlotte tighter for a moment, then released her gently. Go find Papa, darling. I think he's in the study with George. Tell him I need to speak with him, all right? It's important. Charlotte nodded and disappeared into the apartment, her small figure swallowed by the shadows of the hallway. Kate stood slowly, her eyes never leaving Barrett's face. When she spoke again, her voice had changed. Less mother, more Princess of Wales, the steel underneath the warmth. What did you see? She asked. And please, Sergeant Barrett, don't give me the official version. Tell me what actually happened. Barrett hadn't known she remembered his name. Guards were usually invisible to royals unless something went wrong. The fact that Kate knew who he was meant she'd been paying attention, meant she'd noticed him before, meant maybe she'd been watching, waiting, hoping someone in uniform would finally see what she'd been seeing for months. He told her, all of it, Camilla's tone, Charlotte's fear. The raised hand that hadn't struck but didn't need to. The way Charlotte had pressed herself against the wall like she was trying to disappear. The conversation afterward, where Charlotte had insisted Camilla never actually hit her, as if the absence of physical contact made everything else acceptable. Kate listened without interrupting. Her face remained composed, but her hands told the story. They gripped the doorframe, released, gripped again. The same gesture Barrett had seen 1,000 times before. The hands of someone trying very hard to stay calm when every instinct says fight or flee. When Barrett finished, Kate was quiet for a long moment. Then she nodded, once. Thank you for protecting her, and thank you for telling me the truth. Ma'am, Barrett began, but Kate held up a hand. I know what you risked by intervening, she said. I know what the consequences could be for you. Staff members who challenge Camilla tend to find their contracts quietly terminated. Security rotations get reassigned. People disappear from the palace and nobody asks questions. But you did it anyway. You stood between her and my daughter. I won't forget that. Barrett didn't know what to say. Protocol had no script for this moment. No guidelines for what a guard should do when a princess thanks them for protecting her child from another royale. He settled for a simple nod. I'll need you to file an official report, Kate continued. Everything you saw, everything you heard, date, time, exact location. I'll need documentation, because this isn't the first time, Sergeant Barrett, and I don't intend to let there be a next time. She closed the door gently, leaving Barrett alone in the corridor. He stood there for a moment, processing what had just happened, what he'd just set in motion. Then he turned and began walking back toward his post. His rotation didn't end for another hour. He had duties to fulfill, rules to follow, a job to do. But Barrett knew something had changed that afternoon in the East Gallery corridor. He'd crossed a line, made a choice, and somewhere in the palace, in rooms he'd never see, and conversations he'd never hear, people were already starting to react, already deciding what his choice would cost him, already preparing consequences he couldn't begin to imagine. What Barrett didn't know yet was that Kate was already on the phone with William, that William was already pulling security footage from the corridor cameras. that Anne had noticed the unusual activity in the surveillance office and made a phone call of her own, that a web of protection and investigation was already spreading through the palace, invisible to most, but absolutely real. He'd thought the moment of standing between Camilla and Charlotte was the hardest part. He was about to learn that sometimes the real fight starts after you've already thrown yourself in front of the danger. The palace surveillance office sits in the northwest basement, behind a door marked Facilities Management. Most staff members walk past it every day without knowing what's really there. Inside, 6 monitors display feeds from 243 cameras positioned throughout the royal residences. Not in bedrooms or bathrooms, obviously, but in corridors, entrance halls, gardens, receiving rooms, anywhere security might need to verify who went where and when. The footage runs on a 72-hour loop unless someone flags it for permanent storage. After 3 days, it gets recorded over, disappears, like it never existed. Prince William walked into that surveillance office at 1647, less than 30 minutes after Charlotte had appeared at Kate's door. He didn't announce himself, didn't make a formal request through channels, just appeared in the doorway with the kind of quiet intensity that made the 2 technicians on duty immediately sit up straighter. "I need footage from the East Gallery corridor," William said. His voice was calm, but there was steel underneath. "Second floor, East Wing. Today, 1300 to 1500 hours. Everything you've got." The senior technician, a man named Davies who'd worked palace security for 12 years, didn't hesitate. He'd learned early in his career that when a senior royal walked in personally, instead of sending a staff member, you didn't ask questions. You just did what was requested and kept your mouth shut afterward. "Yes, sir, I'll pull it up now." William moved to stand behind Davies's chair, arms crossed, watching as the technician's fingers flew across the keyboard. The monitors flickered, changed, settled on a view of the corridor Barrett had been assigned to. The timestamp read 1300 hours. The corridor was empty, except for Barrett at his post, standing with the perfect stillness that comes from years of military discipline. "Fast forward," William said. "Stop when you see movement in the frame." Davies advanced the footage. The timestamp blurred. 1400, 1415, 1430, then movement. A small figure entering from the right side of the frame. Charlotte. Walking quickly, looking over her shoulder like she was checking if anyone had followed her. She disappeared around the corner toward where the corridor branched off to Camilla's rooms. "Continue," William said. His jaw was tight. Kate had called him 7 minutes after Barrett had left. Told him everything the guard had reported, every word Camilla had said, every gesture Charlotte had made, the raised hand that hadn't struck but didn't need to. William had been in meetings when Kate called. He'd walked out mid-sentence. Let his private secretary apologize to the waiting officials. Because there are some things that matter more than diplomatic courtesy, and protecting your children from psychological abuse ranks pretty damn high on that list. The footage showed Barrett at his post, still, patient. Then his head turned slightly, toward the corridor where Charlotte had disappeared. He was hearing something. The cameras didn't have audio, but his body language told the story. Tension entering his shoulders, his weight shifting forward onto the balls of his feet. The unconscious movement of someone whose instincts are screaming that something is wrong. Then Barrett moved. Not running, but walking with clear purpose around the corner, out of frame. For 43 seconds, the monitor showed an empty corridor, just walls and carpet and the afternoon light filtering through distant windows. When Barrett came back into frame, Charlotte was with him, small beside him, her shoulders hunched inward, her hands clasped in front of her body, the classic posture of a child who's been made to feel ashamed. Barrett walked slightly ahead, leading, but not touching. Professional distance maintained even in crisis. They crossed the corridor and disappeared toward the Cambridge apartments. 21 seconds later, Camilla appeared. She walked into frame from the same direction Charlotte and Barrett had come from. She paused, stood in the middle of the corridor for almost 30 seconds. Her head turned slowly, looking in the direction Barrett and Charlotte had gone. Even on grainy surveillance footage, even from a ceiling-mounted camera, her expression was clear. Cold calculation. The look of someone deciding what to do about a problem that had just presented itself. "Stop there," William said. "Can you zoom in on her face?" Davies clicked buttons. The image enlarged, pixelated slightly, but clear enough. Camilla's expression showed no anger, no frustration, no emotion at all, really. Just that calculating stare. The look of a chess player who'd just lost a piece and was already planning 5 moves ahead to compensate for the loss. William stared at the screen for a long moment. Then he pulled out his phone and took several photos of the monitor. Documentation, evidence. The kind of thing you needed when you were preparing to go to war with someone who technically outranked you in the household hierarchy. "I need this footage flagged for permanent storage," William said. "Not archived, not transferred, kept on the active server. And I need the access logs for this specific file to come directly to me. Anyone who tries to view this footage, I want to know about it immediately." Davies nodded. His fingers were already moving across the keyboard. "Done, sir. The file is locked. You'll receive notifications of any access attempts." "And, Davies," William added, his voice dropping lower, "this conversation never happened. If anyone asks, you never saw me here. Understood?" "Understood, sir." William left the surveillance office the same way he'd entered, quietly, quickly, drawing as little attention as possible. But his mind was racing. The footage confirmed everything Barrett had reported. Confirmed everything Charlotte had said. More importantly, it showed Camilla's reaction afterward. That pause in the corridor, that calculating expression. She wasn't embarrassed about being interrupted. She wasn't concerned about Charlotte's emotional state. She was planning, figuring out how to manage the situation, how to control the narrative before it could become a problem. Barrett was back at his post in the East Gallery corridor. His replacement wasn't due for another 45 minutes. Standard protocol was to remain at position until officially relieved. Don't leave early. Don't abandon your post. No matter what happened during your shift, you stayed until someone came to replace you. But Barrett's mind wasn't on protocol anymore. It was replaying the scene over and over. Camilla's raised hand, Charlotte's pressed against the wall, the choice he'd made to step between them, the conversation with Kate afterward. Every decision felt right in the moment. But now, in the quiet aftermath, Barrett was starting to understand what he'd actually done. He'd challenged the Queen Consort, contradicted her in the middle of a private interaction, made her back down in front of a witness. People had lost their jobs for far less. His phone buzzed, a text message from an unknown number, short, direct. "Private meeting requested. King's study, 1800 hours. Come alone. Dress uniform." Barrett stared at the message. Meetings with the king didn't come through text messages to personal phones. They came through proper channels, security supervisors, formal requests, schedule coordination. Unless someone wanted the meeting kept quiet, unless someone didn't want the usual palace bureaucracy knowing that certain conversations were happening. He texted back a simple confirmation. Then he deleted both messages. If this was going to be that kind of meeting, the less digital trail, the better. The rest of Barrett's shift passed in a blur of routine movements and racing thoughts. No one came down the East Gallery corridor, no royals, no staff, just silence and the distant sound of London traffic filtering through thick stone walls. At 17:45, his replacement arrived. A younger guard named Preston, who nodded a greeting and took position without conversation. Guards didn't chat during rotations. Too much talking made you miss things, made you less alert. So they just traded places in silence and Barrett walked toward the staff changing rooms. Dress uniform meant this was formal, official, the kind of meeting that went into records even if nobody talked about it afterward. Barrett changed carefully, making sure every button was aligned, every crease sharp, every piece of brass polished to reflection. If he was going to face consequences for protecting Charlotte, he'd at least face them looking like a professional. He arrived at the king's private study at 17:58, 2 minutes early. Military training said arriving exactly on time was actually late. You showed up early and waited until you were called. Barrett knocked once, firm, clear. "Come in." The voice was Charles, but there were other voices in there too. Low conversation that stopped abruptly when the door opened. Barrett stepped inside and stopped dead. He'd expected Charles, maybe William, possibly Kate. He hadn't expected Princess Anne sitting in one of the leather chairs near the fireplace. Hadn't expected to see a woman he didn't recognize standing near the window, holding a leather portfolio. Hadn't expected the carefully controlled tension that filled the room like electricity before a storm. "Sergeant Barrett." Charles stood from behind his desk. "Thank you for coming. Please, close the door." Barrett did. The click of the lock engaging sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet room. "I believe you know Prince William and the Princess of Wales," Charles continued. "This is Princess Anne, and this is Margaret Thornton. She's the palace's chief legal counsel. We've asked you here because we need to understand exactly what happened this afternoon in the East Gallery corridor. And I mean exactly. Every word, every gesture, every detail you can remember." So Barrett told them, again, starting from when he first heard the voices. Charlotte's frightened apologies, Camilla's cold precision, the raised hand, the decision to intervene, the lie he'd told about Kate requesting Charlotte's presence. The conversation afterward, where Charlotte insisted Camilla never actually hit her. He left nothing out. Every detail mattered now. The room was silent when he finished. Then Thornton spoke. Her voice was crisp, professional, the tone of someone used to dealing with complicated legal situations. "Sergeant Barrett, in your professional opinion, did you witness a threat of physical violence against Princess Charlotte?" Barrett chose his words carefully. "I witnessed behavior consistent with intimidation tactics." The raised hand, combined with Princess Charlotte's obvious fear and her physical positioning against the wall, suggested an established pattern of psychological control. "But no actual physical contact," Thornton clarified. "No, ma'am, but in my experience, physical contact isn't necessary for abuse to occur. Fear can be just as damaging as violence." Anne leaned forward in her chair. She'd been quiet until now, just watching, listening, evaluating. "How long have you been on palace duty, Sergeant?" 6 years, Your Royal Highness." "And in those 6 years, have you ever witnessed similar behavior from the Queen Consort toward any of the children?" Barrett hesitated. This was dangerous territory. Answering meant making accusations based on observation rather than evidence. But not answering meant potentially leaving Charlotte vulnerable to future incidents. "I've observed interactions that concerned me," Barrett said carefully, "particularly in the past 8 months, but nothing as overt as what I witnessed today." William stood from where he'd been leaning against the desk. "We've pulled the corridor surveillance footage. It confirms everything Barrett just described. Charlotte entering Camilla's area, disappearing around the corner, Barrett following, both emerging shortly after, with Charlotte clearly distressed. Then Camilla appearing and standing in the corridor for an extended period, watching them leave. The cameras don't cover the section where the actual confrontation occurred, Thornton added. That corridor branches into private residential areas where cameras aren't permitted, so we have circumstantial evidence, but no direct visual confirmation of the raised hand or the verbal exchange. We have my daughter's testimony, Kate said. Her voice was quiet but absolutely firm. "We have Barrett's eyewitness account. We have footage showing Charlotte's emotional state before and after. We have a pattern of behavior that multiple staff members have quietly reported over the past months. How much more evidence do we need before we acknowledge what's happening?" Charles rubbed his temples. The weight of impossible choices was visible on his face. "What you're describing is a family matter that involves my wife. The implications of taking formal action are considerable. This isn't just about protecting Charlotte. It's about the stability of the entire household, the public perception, the constitutional considerations." "With respect, sir," Anne interrupted, her voice cut through the room like a knife. "Bugger the constitutional considerations. We're talking about a 9-year-old child who's being psychologically terrorized in her own home. If we can't protect one little girl because we're worried about public relations, then what exactly are we protecting?" The silence that followed was absolute. Anne had just said what everyone else was thinking, but too careful to voice. She'd stripped away the diplomatic language and reduced the situation to its core truth. A child needed protection. Everything else was secondary. "I want Barrett assigned to Charlotte's personal detail," William said. "Effective immediately. Anytime she's in a situation where she might encounter Camilla, I want him present. Official capacity. Proper documentation. Nothing that can be challenged or dismissed." Thornton shook her head. "That could be interpreted as an admission that we believe Charlotte needs protection from a senior royal. It raises questions we may not want to answer publicly." "Then let them ask the questions," Kate said. "Let them wonder, because I'm done pretending everything is fine. I'm done watching my daughter shrink every time Camilla enters a room. I'm done explaining away bruised confidence as childhood sensitivity." Someone finally saw what was happening and had the courage to intervene. "I'm not going to punish that courage by sending Barrett back to corridor duty and leaving Charlotte vulnerable." Charles looked at each of them in turn. His son, his daughter-in-law, his sister, the lawyer who'd served his mother for 20 years, the guard who'd risked everything to protect a frightened child. The weight of leadership meant making choices that satisfied no one, but protected everyone, or at least tried to. "Barrett stays on Charlotte's detail," Charles said finally. "But we do it quietly. Rotation assignments that appear normal on paper, but ensure he's always within sight when family interactions occur. Margaret, I need you to start documenting everything. Every incident, every concern, every piece of evidence. If this escalates, if we need to take formal action, I want our position to be unassailable." He turned to Barrett. "You understand what you've stepped into. This isn't a simple security matter anymore. You've become part of a situation that could reshape this family. There will be pressure to remove you, efforts to discredit your account, attempts to make your continued employment untenable. Are you prepared for that?" Barrett met the king's eyes. "I'm prepared to do my job, sir, which is protecting the people in this household who need protecting, regardless of consequences." Charles nodded slowly. "Then we understand each other. Dismissed, Sergeant. You'll receive your new rotation assignment by morning." Barrett left the study with his mind reeling. He'd walked in expecting termination or reassignment to some remote posting. Instead, he'd just been made Charlotte's shadow, her unofficial guardian, the person standing between her and whatever came next. And Barrett had the growing certainty that what came next wasn't going to be resolved in quiet meetings and carefully worded documentation. What came next was going to require the kind of courage that didn't show up in military handbooks, the kind that meant standing your ground even when everything told you to step aside. The new rotation assignments came through at 6 the next morning. Barrett read them twice to make sure he understood. He was now officially assigned to Family Event Security, Rotation 3, which sounded routine on paper, but Rotation 3 covered all educational activities, meal times, and private family gatherings involving the Cambridge children. Essentially, anywhere Charlotte went during palace hours, Barrett would be within visual range. William had kept his word, done it quietly, made it look like standard security protocol instead of what it actually was. Protection detail against internal threats. Barrett reported for duty at 7:30. Charlotte's morning schedule showed breakfast with her brothers at 8, followed by piano lessons in the music room at 9:15. Simple, ordinary. The kind of morning that happened in the palace 1,000 times without incident. Except this morning, Camilla had decided to take breakfast in the family dining room instead of her private suite. The first time she'd done so in 3 weeks. The timing wasn't coincidental. Barrett positioned himself outside the dining room door. Standard placement, close enough to respond to any situation, far enough to maintain appropriate distance. Through the partially open door, he could hear the children's voices. George talking about a football match, Louis complaining about mathematics homework. Charlotte was quieter, contributing occasional words but mostly just listening. The careful silence of someone trying not to draw attention. Then Camilla's voice cut through the morning conversation. "Charlotte, darling, you're holding your fork incorrectly again. We've discussed this. Tines down when cutting. It's not complicated." Barrett's shoulders tensed. He couldn't see into the room from his position, but he could hear everything. The slight tremor in Charlotte's voice when she apologized. The sound of silverware being adjusted. The silence that followed, thick with unspoken tension. "Better," Camilla continued, "though I notice you're still hunching your shoulders. Posture, please. You represent this family every time you sit at a table, even at breakfast." Kate's voice entered the conversation. Calm, but with an edge, Barrett recognized. "Charlotte's posture is fine, Camilla. She's 9 years old, not attending a state dinner." "Bad habits form early," Camilla replied. "I'm simply trying to help her avoid embarrassment later. Surely you want your daughter to know how to conduct herself properly?" "My daughter conducts herself beautifully," Kate said. Each word was precisely measured. "And she doesn't need constant correction during meals. Breakfast should be pleasant, not a training exercise." The silence that followed was the dangerous kind. Barrett shifted his weight, ready to move if necessary. This was it. The first confrontation since yesterday's incident. Camilla testing boundaries, seeing if Kate would back down now that they were in a public family setting with witnesses present. "Of course," Camilla said finally. "I defer to your parenting choices, though I do think structure and discipline are important. Children need to understand expectations." Barrett heard chair legs scraping against floor. Someone standing. Then William's voice, carefully neutral. "Charlotte, why don't you go practice your piano scales before your lesson? You wanted to work on that new piece." Footsteps, small ones, moving quickly toward the door. Charlotte appeared in the doorway, her face composed but her eyes telling a different story. She saw Barrett immediately. Something flickered across her expression. Relief, maybe. Or recognition that she wasn't alone, that someone was watching, someone who'd already proven they'd stand between her and threat. "Good morning, Your Royal Highness," Barrett said quietly. "Good morning, Sergeant Barrett." Charlotte's voice was soft but steady. She'd learned overnight that Barrett was now part of her security detail. Kate had explained it carefully, made it sound routine, nothing to worry about, just normal palace procedure. But Charlotte was smart enough to understand what it really meant, smart enough to know that normal guards didn't get reassigned overnight without reason. Barrett walked with her to the music room, not directly beside her. That would look too obvious, but close enough. Within sight, within reach. The kind of positioning that appeared professional, but was actually deeply personal. Protection masquerading as protocol. The piano teacher, an elderly woman named Mrs. Henshaw, who'd taught 3 generations of royals, was already waiting. She smiled at Charlotte and gestured to the piano bench. Barrett took position outside the music room door, leaving it slightly ajar. He could see Charlotte through the opening, see her hands on the keys, see her shoulders relax slightly as she began playing scales. Music was safe. Music had clear rules that didn't change. Music didn't criticize or correct or make her feel small. What Barrett didn't see was Camilla approaching from the opposite corridor. She moved quietly for someone in heels, appeared at his elbow before he registered her presence. When he turned, she was standing less than 2 feet away, close enough to make normal conversation uncomfortable, close enough to be an invasion of personal space. The same intimidation tactic she'd used on Charlotte, making people feel crowded, pushed, controlled. "Sergeant Barrett." Her voice was cordial, pleasant even, but her eyes were cold. "I wanted to speak with you about yesterday's incident. I feel there may have been some misunderstanding." Barrett stood at attention, proper military bearing. "Ma'am, you see, Charlotte has a tendency to exaggerate situations when she feels she's being disciplined. A child's perspective can be somewhat unreliable. I'm sure you understand." Camilla's smile never reached her eyes. "I would hate for a simple parenting moment to be misinterpreted as something more serious, especially by someone unfamiliar with family dynamics." Barrett kept his expression neutral. She was trying to rewrite history, establish a narrative where he'd misunderstood what he saw, where Charlotte was the unreliable party, where nothing inappropriate had occurred. It was textbook manipulation. And it wouldn't have worked even if Barrett hadn't spent 6 years learning to read exactly this kind of behavior. "I reported what I observed, ma'am," Barrett said, "as required by my duty." "Of course. Duty." Camilla's tone shifted, still pleasant, but harder underneath. "I admire that, though I wonder if you fully understand whose duty you're serving. This household has many members, many competing interests. Loyalty can be complicated when you're caught between different perspectives." She was threatening him, not overtly, nothing he could report or document, but the message was clear. Choose your allegiance carefully, because backing the wrong royal could end your career. "My duty is to protect members of this household from harm," Barrett said. "All members, regardless of age or rank." Camilla's smile finally dropped. "How noble. Though I should mention that protection sometimes requires understanding context, understanding that what appears harmful to an outsider might actually be necessary discipline. Children need structure, Sergeant Barrett. They need to learn boundaries. Sometimes that learning process looks uncomfortable to people who don't understand the bigger picture." She was done pretending. This was the real message. Stand down. Look the other way. Accept that what happens between her and Charlotte is family business and not his concern. Barrett had heard variations of this speech before, from abusive parents justifying bruises, from authority figures defending psychological control. The words changed, but the intent remained constant. Mind your own business, stay quiet, let us handle our own. "I understand perfectly, ma'am," Barrett said, and he did. He understood that Camilla had no intention of changing her behavior, that she viewed Charlotte as something to be shaped and controlled, that she resented anyone who interfered with that control. Most importantly, he understood that this conversation meant he'd made an enemy, that from this moment forward, Camilla would be looking for any excuse to have him removed from palace duty. "I'm glad we had this talk," Camilla said. She was already turning away, dismissing him. "I do hope your new assignment works out well, though palace security rotations can be so unpredictable. People move on for all sorts of reasons." She walked away, her heels clicking against the floor. Barrett watched her go and felt the weight of what he'd just committed to. This wasn't going to end quietly. Camilla wasn't going to accept his presence in Charlotte's orbit without fighting back. She'd use her position, her influence, her connections. She'd pressure Charles, make William's life difficult, create situations where Barrett's continued employment became politically untenable. But as Barrett stood there, listening to Charlotte play piano in the next room, hearing the confidence returning to her fingers, As she moved through a complicated piece, he realized something important. He'd made the right choice. Not the easy choice, not the smart choice from a career perspective, but the right one. The one he could live with. The one that would let him look at himself in the mirror 20 years from now without regret. The weeks that followed established a new normal in the palace. Barrett shadowed Charlotte through her daily routines, piano lessons and homework sessions, and afternoon walks in the garden. His presence became familiar, expected. Charlotte stopped looking surprised when she turned around and found him nearby, started to relax in ways she hadn't before, started speaking up in family conversations, started taking up space instead of shrinking into corners. Camilla maintained perfect civility on the surface, cordial greetings in corridors, polite acknowledgement at family gatherings, but she never spoke to Charlotte directly when Barrett was in range, never offered corrections or criticisms or helpful suggestions. The raised hand never appeared again, not because Camilla had changed, but because she knew someone was watching, someone who'd already proven they'd intervene, someone who couldn't be intimidated into silence. 3 months after the incident in the East Gallery corridor, Charles called Barrett to his study again. This time alone. No William, no Kate, no lawyers or witnesses, just king and guard in a quiet room. "I wanted you to know that I'm aware of what your intervention has cost you," Charles said. "The transfer requests Camilla has filed, the complaints about your conduct, the suggestions that your presence creates uncomfortable family dynamics. I've denied every single one, because protecting Charlotte is more important than keeping peace with my wife." He paused, looking older than he had 3 months ago. The weight of choosing between spouse and granddaughter visible in the lines around his eyes. "You did something most people wouldn't have done. You saw a child in distress and you acted. Consequences be damned. That's the definition of courage, and it's the kind of courage this family needs more of." Barrett stood at attention, unsure how to respond to a king who was essentially apologizing for putting him in an impossible situation. "Charlotte is thriving now," Charles continued. "Her teachers have noticed. Her confidence is returning. She laughs again during family meals. That's because of you, because you stood between her and harm when nobody else was willing to. I can't give you a medal for this, can't make it public recognition, but I can make sure you know that your service matters, that you made a difference in ways that will affect this family for generations." Barrett finally found his voice. "I was just doing my job, sir." "No," Charles said quietly. "You were doing what was right. There's a difference, and that difference is everything. If this story showed you something about the courage it takes to protect the vulnerable, even when the powerful try to stop you, make sure you're subscribed to Royal Guard Files. We share these untold stories from inside the palace walls every single day. Drop a comment below and tell us this. Would you have made the same choice Barrett did, knowing it might end your career? We'll see you in the next one.